The quiet calm of a Texas summer afternoon was shattered on August 2nd, 1997, when a passerby stumbled upon a gruesome find on the east side of Lake Arlington. There, near the water's edge, lay the decomposed body of an unknown man. Authorities were called, and a baffling mystery began that endures to this day. The victim was a white male, estimated to be between 40 and 55 years old, and around 5'10". Forensic analysis suggested he had been deceased for about 1 to 2 months, likely since June or July of 1997. There were no signs of any acute injuries, and the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death from the remains. Found in a relatively remote spot by the lake, this John Doe raised many questions from the start, and his mystery continues on today, nearly 20 years later. The man had medium-length brown hair and was discovered wearing casual summer attire. He was dressed in cut-off Wrangler denim shorts, white Converse sneakers with red trim, and a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses. Along with his clothing, several personal items were recovered, which could serve to identify who this man is. These included a silver-colored necklace, a lighter, a folding pocket knife, a purple comb, and a gold-toned token emblazoned with a riverboat and the words, "No cash value." Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any photographs of these items online on NamUs or on any other sources. This is, of course, a bit of an issue since silver-colored necklace doesn't serve to narrow things down very much. At any rate, these belongings painted a rough sketch of his life, at least to those investigators who were able to view them directly. Notably, the token was what has been described as a generic arcade or casino token. Investigators checked its origin, but that went nowhere since such tokens were mass-produced. Personally, though, without seeing the token itself, I'd be wary of any such conclusion, and I suspect there may have been some minor distinctions added that could be a clue. Despite the evidence recovered, nothing found with the body gave away the man's identity. Unfortunately, he carried no wallet, no identification, and no other forms of identifying paperwork. Authorities released a forensic sketch as well, which is quite distinctive, but this too led to nothing. Notably, his fingerprints were taken, but they didn't match any entries in law enforcement databases. Dental records were also compared against missing persons reports, with no success. Years later, a DNA profile was eventually obtained from his remains and uploaded to national databases, but as yet, it returned no matches either. It quickly became clear that this case wasn't about to be cracked with 90s forensic technology, so detectives looked at the context in which he was found. He was on an isolated patch of shoreline littered with empty bottles and trash, and there was evidence it was a local party spot. This environmental clue hinted that he might have been there socializing or camping, but the cops were unable to find any abandoned campsite that might have been his. That said, this isn't necessarily unusual given the post-mortem interval on this case, and any number of factors could have led to his camp being taken down within that interval. Unfortunately, despite police requests, no witnesses ever came forward to say they saw a stranger in the area in the relevant time period. That said, investigators didn't find his body until months later, and of course memories had already begun to fade at that point. With each avenue turning up empty, the case went cold. In the absence of answers, several theories have been put forward about who this man was and how he perished. One theory is that he was a transient or homeless drifter who lived off the grid. Perhaps he had no fixed home and moved from place to place, which would explain why no missing person report ever matched him. He might not have had close family in touch, or those who knew him didn't realize he was missing. However, running against the homeless theory is that he wasn't dressed in the layered style that homeless people generally adopt, so they can carry their entire wardrobe with them. Another possibility is that his death was a misadventure or a simple accident. He could have been fishing or drinking by the water and ended up drowning or suffering a fatal fall or medical emergency. The fact that the area appeared to be a party spot supports this idea. He might have been out there with others late at night, and something went wrong. If he was intoxicated or unwell and collapsed, the people with him might have panicked and left him, especially if they were afraid of legal trouble. Notably, under this theory, both the John Doe and the other people involved may have been partaking in less than legitimate pharmaceuticals. An accident in such a secluded area could easily go unreported and undocumented under these circumstances. There is also the theory of foul play, though evidence for this is limited. The remote location raises the question of whether someone could have slain him elsewhere and dumped his body by the lake to avoid detection. However, without obvious trauma on the remains, there's no clear indication of this actually happening. That said, it's possible he was suffocated, something that wouldn't necessarily leave a mark on bones. But again, this is purely speculative. Investigators didn't have enough information to label the case as foul play, so it remains classified as an unexplained event. As of 2025, this John Doe, found on the shores of Lake Arlington, is still unidentified. However, forensic science is advancing rapidly, and there's hope that forensic genetic genealogy can finally crack the mystery of his identity. From there, the cops will theoretically be able to build out the last days, weeks, and months of his life and determine what actually happened to him. In July 1971, two boys walking near Route 99 in Woodstock, Maryland, found a woman clinging to life in a wooded field off a dirt road. She was unconscious, badly sunburned, and had no identification on her whatsoever. Rescuers rushed her to a Baltimore hospital, where doctors performed emergency brain surgery in an attempt to save her life, but she never regained consciousness to tell anyone who she was. She perished about 2 months later, on what would have been her 47th birthday, her name still unknown. The medical examiner determined that a violent blow to her abdomen had caused a fatal stroke, so her death was ruled a slaying. For more than 50 years, the mystery of the Woodstock Jane Doe remained completely unsolved. Police periodically revisited the case, but every effort to identify the woman fell short. Investigators even circulated sketches of her face in newspapers, but nobody recognized her. Finally, in 2024, Howard County investigators turned to advanced forensic technology to crack the case and referred the case to Othram. Othram is a forensic genetic genealogy company that has been on an absolute tear in the last number of years, helping solve cold cases. Genetic genealogy led to an elderly man in Ohio named Charles Sharkey, who turned out to be a very close relative of the mystery woman. In fact, further testing revealed Charles was her son. Armed with this discovery, detectives located another potential relative, Charles's older sister, Mildred Cantwell, living in Illinois. In September 2025, 54 years after the woman's death, authorities announced that the Jane Doe had been identified as Sarah Bell Sharkey. She was a Pennsylvania native who had taken the last name Sharkey after marriage in the 1940s. It was an astonishing twist. The victim not only got her name back, but also had 2 children still alive to learn the truth. Sharkey was the 47-year-old mother of 2 who had vanished from her children's lives in the mid-20th century, only to be found brutally assaulted in Maryland years later. Solving Sarah Sharkey's identity also brought about an unexpected family reunion. As children, Charles and Mildred had been placed in an orphanage and adopted into different families, losing track of each other and of their mother entirely. The siblings had been separated since the early 1950s and hadn't seen one another since childhood. Since they were so young when they were split up, they only had vague memories of one another, and they never knew what happened to their biological mother. In fact, both Charles and Mildred had spent significant portions of their life trying to piece together their own personal history. That all changed when, 70 years apart, the brother and sister were put back in touch by the cold case detectives. The two began speaking on the phone nearly every day and planned to meet in person for the first time in nearly 70 years. They expressed relief at finally learning their mother's fate and an overwhelming sense of joy at finding each other again. Charles said he had believed he would never reconnect with his family, and Mildred said knowing the truth about her mother gave her long-awaited peace. But of course, this is a series on unsolved mysteries, and the obvious question remains here. The investigation has now been reopened into the slaying of Sarah Sharkey, and detectives are working to retrace her last known steps. They know she spent most of her life in Pennsylvania, which makes her presence in rural Howard County in Maryland perplexing. One theory is that she may have traveled to Maryland with someone she knew, and that this person turned violent. The fact that her purse was missing hints at a possible robbery or an assailant's attempt to conceal her identity. Investigators have revealed that they believe she was left in that field on purpose, perhaps dumped there after an assault in a different location. No suspects have been publicly named yet, but knowing Sarah's identity gives police new avenues to explore. They are interviewing any remaining friends, acquaintances, and relatives of Sarah to learn about her life in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Unfortunately, as yet, there's been no photograph released of Sarah to indicate what she looked like. However, a forensic drawing has been released, which the authorities hope will jog someone's memory. Anyway, if you think you recognize this woman, please reach out to the Howard County Cold Case Unit since they're looking to talk to anyone with any potential connections to Sharkey. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit the like button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. In the mid-1980s, Japan was a nation at the apex of its economic power. It was a society defined by an almost futuristic blend of technological innovation, social order, and an unparalleled sense of public safety. At the heart of this modern landscape stood the humble vending machine, the Jidohan Baiki, ready to serve any stranger for the right price. And yeah, that's what I wrote while researching this segment while very sleep-deprived at 3 a.m. But I'm keeping it in, and you've all got to deal with it. More than just a convenience, these machines were a cultural touchstone. Numbering over 5 million, they dotted every city block and rural crossroads, offering everything from cold drinks and hot coffee to noodles and flowers. They were symbols of a high-trust, automated, and profoundly safe society. They were unmanned, unvandalized beacons of convenience that millions of people relied on every single day without a second thought. This implicit trust was the bedrock of a simple daily ritual. But in 1985, an unseen predator would weaponize that trust, turning these symbols of convenience into instruments of a terrifying and indiscriminate evil. The story begins on a spring day, April 30th, 1985, in the city of Fukuyama in Hiroshima Prefecture. A man, whose name has been lost to history, approached a vending machine for a drink. Sitting on top of the machine was an unclaimed bottle of Oronamine C, a popular vitamin-fortified, caffeine-laden energy drink. To him, this wasn't suspicious, but rather, it was a stroke of luck. Otsuka Pharmaceutical, the company that produced the drink, was in the middle of a major buy one get one free promotion to boost sales among a younger demographic. The appearance of an extra bottle would have seemed like a winning ticket, a small welcome gift from someone who wanted to improve the day of a complete stranger. And with that, the man took the bottle and drank it, expecting a boost of energy and likely feeling goodwill towards the person who left it. But what followed wasn't that boost of energy, or even a swift demise, but a slow, inexorable descent into agony. He soon fell ill, but the poison inside him worked with a cruel patience. For an entire month, his body was systematically destroyed from the inside out. He finally succumbed on May 30th, a full 30 days after his fateful encounter with the free drink. The agent of his death was later identified as paraquat dichloride, a potent agricultural herbicide. I'll get into the exact mechanism of this poison shortly, but for now, just imagine your lungs being taken over by endless scar tissue until you literally drown in your own fluids. At the time, no one knew that this horrifying, isolated death was the opening act of a spree that would create one of Japan's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. After the first incident in spring, an eerie silence fell across the nation. For 4 months, the incident in Fukuyama remained an isolated tragedy, unconnected to any larger pattern. The plague returned in September 1985, and it spread with terrifying speed and randomness. On September 5th, a 44-year-old executive named Takashi Sakai drank 2 poisoned vitamin drinks, losing his battle with the poison 6 weeks after. Less than a week after that, the attacks reached the capital, and 52-year-old Haru Otsu picked up a free bottle of Oronamine C. Less than 3 days later, Otsu had perished from the contents of this free drink. Over the course of September, the disturbing incident spread across the entire nation, and there was no discernible pattern to the attacks. They were men and women, young and old, from different professions and social classes. This total randomness shattered any illusion of safety in this high-trust society. Anyone who used a vending machine was a potential target, and the lack of a clear motive made the crimes feel like an act of pure, nihilistic violence. By November 1985, at least 13 people had perished, and dozens more were left seriously ill, suffering lifelong damage. But to fully understand the profound cruelty of these attacks, one must understand the weapon. Paraquat is a commercial herbicide, a mundane chemical used by farmers to control weeds. In the 1980s in Japan, it was dangerously accessible to almost anyone. While purchasers were technically required to demonstrate an agricultural need, the substance could be bought without a formal prescription or identification. The requirement to demonstrate agricultural need was satisfied simply by giving your word that you needed it for pest control. You could simply say that you had a backyard garden that was being overrun with beetles, and next thing you knew, you had your paraquat. You didn't even need a backyard or a garden, and there didn't need to be any beetles. You just had to give your word. After all, in a high-trust society where everyone assumes the best of their fellow citizen, it seemed inconceivable that someone would obtain paraquat to do what the perpetrator did. Notably, the ultimate cause of death is what makes paraquat poisoning uniquely horrific. As I alluded to earlier, it brings on a condition called pulmonary fibrosis. Inside the lungs, the chemical generates an oxygen reaction that causes catastrophic cellular damage, leading to the progressive and irreversible growth of fibrous scar tissue. Paraquat poisoning hijacks the fundamental breathing mechanism and turns it against your body. The soft, pliable tissue of the lungs hardens, making it impossible to expand and contract. Victims find it increasingly difficult to breathe, as if they are slowly being suffocated. In the end, they effectively drown in their own fluids, often fully conscious of their agonizing demise. Simply put, the person who launched this assault against society didn't just want to destroy lives, the perpetrator wanted to inflict maximum suffering doing it. They also wanted to be sure that the people who did survive the poisonous assault would be permanently scarred, literally, for the rest of their lives. For the victims of the vending machine predator, and for the doctors who tried to save them, the most terrible truth was their complete helplessness. There's no antidote for paraquat poisoning, and medical interventions are purely supportive and almost always futile. But with that said, let's get to the manhunt for the perpetrator of this disturbing crime. As the body count rose, a massive police investigation was launched, but it quickly became clear that they were hunting a phantom. The case was a profiler's nightmare, a crime that seemed perfectly designed to defy traditional investigative methods. The perpetrator's randomness was their greatest defense. With no connection between the victims, police could not establish a motive, leaving them with no starting point. The perpetrator was also meticulous in their methods. They chose vending machines in low-traffic areas, ensuring there were never any witnesses to their actions. The technology of the era also worked in their favor. Surveillance cameras were not yet a common feature of the urban landscape, so there was no video evidence to analyze. Most importantly, the perpetrator left nothing behind whatsoever. DNA analysis wasn't yet a tool in the forensic arsenal, but even if it had been, there was nothing to test. With the police investigation at a standstill, the responsibility for public safety shifted dramatically. Unable to catch this silent predator, authorities and corporations were forced to try and prevent the next attack. This led to an unprecedented public safety campaign that transformed the daily life of the nation. Warnings were posted on over 5 million vending machines, a massive logistical undertaking that brought the threat into the public's immediate view. These notices, issued jointly by police, vending machine operators, and soft drink companies, urged the public to adopt a new, defensive position while at these formerly friendly machines. Customers were warned to carefully inspect beverage caps for tampering, to check dispenser slots for any unusual items, and most importantly, to throw away any drinks they found. In the absence of evidence, all that remained was speculation. Criminal psychologists note that poisoners, particularly those who attack anonymously, often fit a specific profile. They tend to be cunning, methodical, and emotionally immature, driven by a deep-seated sense of inadequacy for which they compensate with a desperate need for power and control. Poisoning is the ultimate remote control crime. It allows the perpetrator to feel godlike and omnipotent without the mess of a direct confrontation. Further, the perpetrator's rage is often not directed at a specific individual, but is a nihilistic fury towards existence itself. At the time, Japanese experts offered theories that tried to place the crimes within a national context. A professor of criminal sociology in Tokyo suggested the attacks could be a twisted manifestation of the pressures of Japan's intense and work-oriented society. He speculated that for an individual living under tremendous stress, attacking others indiscriminately could become a disturbed outlet for frustration. Meanwhile, a forensic psychologist who was helping the National Police Agency with the case proposed a more chilling motive at the time. He argued that the perpetrator was likely motivated by the adrenaline rush and the sense of superiority that came from imagining the suffering of their victims. In essence, the perpetrator enjoyed a secret power they held over the lives of complete strangers. Other theories would flourish in the years after the attacks, but I'll get to those in a quick moment. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had started in late November 1985, and with that, the Phantom vanished permanently. In 1986, in direct response to the crisis, the Japanese government took action. It severely restricted the sale of paraquat and mandated that the chemical be reformulated into a less concentrated, less toxic version, even when sold for legitimate usage. One theory surrounding the paraquat poisonings is that they were linked to Yakuza extortion. The logic behind this suspicion rests on how the attacks coincided with Japan's booming beverage industry. During this period, vending machine operators and drink manufacturers were making enormous profits. Organized crime groups had long infiltrated legitimate industries through protection rackets, forcing businesses to pay for quote-unquote safety. In this light, the poisonings may have been a demonstration aimed at beverage companies that resisted such demands. By contaminating products placed on vending machines, the culprit created widespread fear, tarnishing consumer trust, and damaging corporate reputations. The randomness of the victims would have amplified the terror, ensuring maximum pressure on the companies rather than targeting specific individuals. However, no direct evidence ever tied the Yakuza to the paraquat cases, and criminologists note that this doesn't fit the pattern of their crimes. While they're known to engage in corporate manipulation, they generally do so in a discreet way, so as not to involve the authorities. The level of attention and heat that would have been brought from engaging in a mass poisoning event is unprecedented for the Yakuza. Further, and perhaps most importantly, skeptics note that there was a total lack of demands, and no ransom note was ever issued. This suggests the crimes may have instead been the work of a lone poisoner, driven by nihilism rather than profit. However, perhaps the most disturbing theory related to this case has nothing whatsoever to do with a lone nihilist out for revenge against the world. There's the theory that the attacks may have been orchestrated by the North Korean state to inflict terror upon the Japanese populace. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with this period in history may believe that this is a fringe conspiracy theory with no backing to it whatsoever. Well, that's where you're wrong, because during this time, North Korean agents were literally pulling up in submarines and kidnapping Japanese citizens, amongst other crimes. However, skeptics have a difficult time squaring the poison used with this theory. North Korea has access to much more powerful chemical agents that can guarantee virtually instant results. They claim that had this been a campaign by this state actor, paraquat wouldn't have been used. That said, the counterpoint to this is that North Korean sleeper agents may have simply had to work with the poisons they could obtain locally. The case of the vending machine poisoner remains completely unsolved at this point. No potential perpetrator was ever identified, and the motive remains a subject of speculation. Notably, in 2010, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for severe crimes such as this. However, the abolition of the law isn't retroactive, so even if the poisoner was caught today, they wouldn't be able to be prosecuted criminally. In August 2000, a routine construction dig in Ocala, Florida, turned into a crime scene when workers uncovered a human skeleton hidden inside a red sleeping bag. The remains were buried on Southwest 12th Street, alongside discarded alcohol cans and bottles. It was a shocking find, a makeshift grave in the heart of Marion County, and it marked the beginning of a mystery that endures to this day. This anonymous victim, soon dubbed the Marion County John Doe, has remained unidentified for over 25 years. The Ocala Public Works crew that found the skeleton immediately alerted police. The fact that it was wrapped in a sleeping bag and deliberately covered with soil raised immediate suspicions of foul play. Forensic examination determined the deceased was a white male around 45 to 60 years old and stood about 5'7". He had no identification on him, so examiners had to rely on physical clues. Notably, he was missing most of his teeth and had a distinct gap between his upper front teeth. This unusual dental profile was publicized in case it matched someone's long-lost relative or friend, but no hits have been made so far. The skeleton also showed evidence of past injuries, which the authorities believed could be used to identify the man. Several ribs and the nose had been broken at some point, and a foot bone had a healed fracture. Notably, these injuries were healed, and for the broken nose, it was likely that he had sought medical intervention. Notably, investigators didn't find any evidence of any significant acute trauma on his remains. However, given the clandestine burial, the Ocala Police Department treated the case as a likely slaying right from the start. Along with the bones, detectives collected the man's clothing and belongings for clues. The John Doe was found with multiple layers of clothes on his body, including black sweatpants, blue jeans, and a pair of green sweats. The odd combination of wearing several pairs of pants suggests he may have been living outdoors and carrying his entire wardrobe on his person. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you'll probably already know this practice is often seen among homeless individuals who wear all their layers both for warmth and convenience. Notably, a generic Wilson wristwatch was still on his wrist, and the red sleeping bag likely served as his bedding. These personal items paint a picture of a man living rough, camping out in an empty lot, or perhaps living out in the woods. Based on the condition of the remains, experts estimated that the man died anywhere from 8 months to 5 years before he was found. In other words, he likely perished sometime in the mid-1990s through late 1999, a massive span of time that gave the perpetrator a huge head start. Whoever buried him in that unused plot managed to keep the secret until development work unearthed it by chance. Notably, DNA analysis, often the trump card in modern cold cases, has been problematic here. No usable DNA profile could be obtained from the remains due to severe degradation. Without a DNA profile, advanced forensic genealogy techniques can't be applied yet to hunt down relatives. Instead, investigators have relied on traditional detective work and public outreach. Over the years, forensic artists created composite images reconstructing the man's face, and these have been circulated through media and police channels. Notably, it's unclear to me if the John Doe's remains have been preserved and sent for modern forensic testing. This would allow the authorities to search the CODIS database at the very least. If successful, this would give the decedent his name back and would serve as a better starting point for actually solving the crime against him as well. Without solid leads, several theories have emerged about who this man was and how he met his end. The prevailing idea is that he was a homeless individual who fell victim to violence. Perhaps he was camping on that property and encountered trouble, such as a robbery or an altercation that turned into something way more serious. The empty liquor bottles at the scene suggest alcohol might have been involved, though given the passage of time, it's possible that these were simply incidental. That said, it's easy to imagine two people drinking together in that secluded spot and a fight breaking out, ending in tragedy. In such a scenario, the assailant may have hastily buried the body to conceal the crime. Another possibility is that the case doesn't actually involve any foul play at all. If the John Doe passed away of an overdose while with companions, those people might have panicked and buried him to avoid legal trouble. Alternatively, he may have simply perished due to natural causes, and the people with him may have done their best to give him a burial with what they had on hand. This could explain the lack of overt trauma on the remains. More speculative ideas have also been floated by amateur sleuths. It does always remain possible that a serial predator targeted this John Doe. Unfortunately, people living on the outskirts of life, like the homeless, are often targeted by these predators simply because in general, no one will notice that they've gone missing. If a homeless person vanishes, they're generally assumed to have moved on to greener pastures, even by their own friends from the streets. Further, even when they're reported missing, generally by other homeless people, the police generally don't sink any investigative efforts into the case. For now, the Marion County John Doe remains nameless, but he's not forgotten. The hope is that one day this man's identity will be restored and the full story of what happened to him will finally come to light. Love's Labour's Won is a Shakespeare play that history forgot, a comedy known only by name, with no surviving script. We don't know much about this piece of Shakespearean lost media, but what we do know provides a few tantalizing clues. The existence of Love's Labour's Won is documented by Shakespeare's contemporaries. The first reference comes from a London writer named Francis Mears. In his survey of Elizabethan literature, Mears praises Shakespeare and lists several of his comedies by name, including Love's Labour's Won. All the other plays Mears mentions are familiar works still performed today, which makes the disappearance of Love's Labour's Won especially intriguing. A second clue surfaced in 1953 when a bookseller discovered a fragment of a 1603 bookseller's inventory. This old list of books includes a number of popular play titles of the day, among them Love's Labour's Lost and Love's Labour's Won. In other words, as of 1603, a play called Love's Labour's Won was apparently available in print, alongside Shakespeare's other works. This strongly suggests the play wasn't just a rumor, but had been written down and sold as a playbook in its time. No copy of Love's Labour's Won is known to survive today. It wasn't included in the first folio of Shakespeare's collected plays in 1623, likely because the editors could not find any manuscript or printed copy of it. Without a text, the story of Love's Labour's Won has been reconstructed through theories. One leading theory is that it was a true lost play, specifically a sequel to Love's Labour's Lost. Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost ends on an unresolved note. The couples part ways for a year instead of celebrating weddings. This unusual ending practically invites a continuation where the labors of love are finally won after the promised year. Shakespeare might have written a follow-up comedy showing the reunions and romantic resolutions that were deferred in the first play. The title Love's Labour's Won fits perfectly for such a sequel. Notably, while sequels to comedies were rare in that era, this could have been an exception to the general rule. Another possibility is that Love's Labour's Won wasn't an entirely new work at all, but an alternative name for a Shakespearean comedy that does survive. In the Elizabethan era, plays sometimes had a number of different titles that they were known by. For instance, Twelfth Night was also popularly called What You Will during Shakespeare's era. Some scholars suggest that Love's Labour's Won might have been an early title or nickname for another comedy written around the same time. The most popular candidate is Much Ado About Nothing, a play written around 1598 that ends in triumphant pairings and could be seen as Love's Labour's Won by its conclusion. Notably, Much Ado About Nothing was not listed by Mears in 1598, which could make sense if it was referenced under a different title. Another candidate often discussed is The Taming of the Shrew. This comedy existed by the 1590s and was conspicuously absent from Mears's list, which once led to speculation that Love's Labour's Won was referring to the shrew. However, the 1603 inventory later found in 1953 clearly lists The Taming of the Shrew separately from Love's Labour's Won. This implies that they were distinct items one could order, strongly suggesting that they were separate works. A further suggestion is All's Well That Ends Well, a play in which a female protagonist works hard to win over an unwilling man, ultimately roping him into marriage through stalking and deceit. Essentially, according to supporters of this theory, this is love's labor that's eventually won. Yet All's Well is generally thought to have been written a few years after 1598 and has a more dramatic and disturbing tone, making it a much less likely match for the reference. That said, some believe that the title could be intended as a subtle nod to just how disturbing the events of the play are. As evidence for this, the title All's Well That Ends Well also conveys the sense of unease Shakespeare likely intended to instill in the audience at the conclusion of the play. In truth, no existing play can be definitively proven to be Love's Labour's Won under another name, so the debate continues. Based on the evidence, the play was probably written in the mid to late 1590s and very likely performed by Shakespeare's company as part of their repertoire. The 1598 and 1603 references indicate it had enough presence and recognition to warrant printing. If a printed edition of Love's Labour's Won was indeed published around 1603, no copies survived the following centuries. This isn't surprising, as many publications of that era have been lost, especially if they didn't have large print runs. By the early 1600s, Love's Labour's Won may simply have fallen out of use. Without reprints or a place in the first folio, it faded from memory. It's important to remember that many of Shakespeare's works were only preserved due to their inclusion in the first folio. Whatever the case, by the time the first folio was compiled in 1623, it was either not warranted for inclusion or was already a lost work. The mystery of Love's Labour's Won highlights how many works of Shakespeare's era have vanished. Historians estimate that less than a fifth of all plays written in Elizabethan England still exist today in any form. The rest survive merely as titles or fragments in records. Even Shakespeare likely had other works that didn't survive, and in this context, Love's Labour's Won isn't an anomaly, but part of a larger pattern of literary loss. Yet the idea of a missing Shakespeare play continues to intrigue and inspire, and finding a complete copy could perhaps be the holy grail of lost media.